Dungeons & Dragons is the hamburger of role-playing games. It's simple, and you can do a lot with it. It's pretty easy to flavor it with just about any additional ingredients you fancy. Just about anyone should be able to make it with a varying degree of success. Also, like a hamburger, I enjoy Dungeons & Dragons. But, like my culinary palate, my gaming palate sometimes needs to try something a little different. So here are 3 fantasy RPG systems that are like Dungeons & Dragons, but aren't. Hello, I'm Dave, and you are watching Table Ready Gaming. Now, if that intro just made you hungry, and you're off to get a hamburger, that's totally fair. I'll be here when you get back. Just don't forget to tip your server. But if you're planning on sticking around, please don't forget to tip your YouTuber by hitting that like button. First on my list is a game called Hackmaster. This game, mechanically, is probably the most like Dungeons & Dragons. In the sense that you roll a d20 for attacks and skill checks. After that, it starts to differ pretty heavily. Now, while the trend in modern game design seems to be a more streamlined approach to games that are rule-light systems that, focus on a more narrative approach, Hackmaster isn't afraid to put the game back into role-playing games. And it kind of argues that complexity is just a coward's word for flavor. Hackmaster is, at its heart, a pretty crunchy system. Plenty of tables to reference, and it isn't afraid to calculate a hit that starts with a strike from an opponent's sword and ends by impacting your character's large toe. Hackmaster says, why have 6 stats when you can have 7? This game will have you calculating your character's body mass index during character creation and rolling for your lineage instead of just building a backstory. Oh, and once sessions are underway, you better believe you're tracking XP. But that's not it. You're also tracking your character's honor and fame as well. Now, Hackmaster is a game that at its core believes that heroes are just ordinary people who have been put into extraordinary situations. It features a pretty brutal combat system that revolves around an exploding dice mechanic. This means that any dice that rolls its highest value can roll again and add that next roll to its overall damage. Now, this can be especially hard on those low-level magic users. Now, in the world of Hackmaster, if you want reality-bending magics, you better believe you're going to have to earn them.
My lord.
And if you're a 6-level fighter, don't just shrug off that kobold with a spear. Death by pointy stick is really just one bad dice throw away. And you better believe a critical fail is totally a thing in this game. And if you believe that role-playing games are where players and game masters work together to weave a narrative, Hackmaster respectfully disagrees. So why do I love this game? Okay, so by this point, you're probably thinking Hackmaster is just a throw you in the dirt and kick you while you're down. And probably, honestly, a hard to manage rule set. And while there's a little more bookkeeping for a GM in this system than others, there's also, in a way, a lot less work. In fact, some game masters may find this game easy to run, because the stories in Hackmaster don't come from the game master. It comes from the dice. And the role-playing opportunities just kind of spring out of this unforgiving rule set. If you're running a game of Hackmaster, as a DM, you don't have to come up with stakes, as all the drama of Hackmaster comes from your players simply stumbling out of one crisis and into another. In Hackmaster, you won't need big bads planning on destroying the world. Instead, you have plenty of drama, simply trying to get your party from one town to the next. And if you have players who are struggling to develop a character and come up with a backstory and motivation, then Hackmaster excels at making roles and characters that that your players can kind of just step into. And in this game, the adventure and the game are the protagonist, not individual characters. This game features one of my favorite initiative systems of any pen and paper role-playing game. See, in Hackmaster, every action has a cooldown, and it takes so many ticks after an action until you can do something else. Each round of combat is simply a tick, and anyone whose cooldown has expired can move or do an action on this tick. That means your barbarian might be hitting like a Mack truck with that D12, but that meanwhile, the rogue and her dagger is just going D4, 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 D4 every other tick. So the last word for Hackmaster is that you can tell this game is a labor of love. Now, while it might be a little rough at parts, it's full of extra flavor bits that really sell it. For example, is this monster edible? And if so, will society judge me poorly for eating it? Also, don't forget the 176-page critical hit PDF that rolls a D10,000 for every critical hit. Now, when it comes to rule cool and raw setting awesomeness, my second game is pretty hard to beat. Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay is now into its 4th edition and has lovingly been re-rendered by Cubicle 7. Now, while the old world's parent company is apparently taking a break to explore other fantasy settings, they have left their poor abandoned child in capable hands. Cubicle 7 has done a great job bringing back this setting and improving on the much loved 2nd edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. Their team has also generated a massive amount of amazing looking artwork that really shows off this world. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the Warhammer world as a setting, then let me break it down to you like this. If Dungeons & Dragons is to high fantasy, like say Lord of the Rings, where honorable heroes go on grand quest to defeat a great evil, then Warhammer is a low fantasy, kind of like Game of Thrones, where off-cast miscreants kill a man in the gutter for his shoes. In D&D, you have noble classes like Paladin, Priest, or Mage. Even your less honorable classes, like say Warlocks and Rogues in Dungeons & Dragons, still do have an air of respectability about them. Now, counter that with Warhammer, which has starting careers like Pitfighter, Footpad, or one of my personal favorites, Ratcatcher. That the Ratcatcher career has the best starting equipment in the market, and that would be a small but vicious dog. Look at it, there it is! With Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, you won't be needing that D20. Instead, you're going to be using a D100. Wait a second, that's 2 dice, not 1! And you'd be right. The way a D100 works in Warhammer Fantasy is that you roll 2 D10. One represents the 10th place of the number, and the other represents the 1 place. You roll the 2 together and get a result of 1 to 100. Now, if you're one of those gamers that just feels like you cannot roll a high number to save your life, then well, you're in luck. Because rolling low numbers in Warhammer Fantasy will kind of keep your character alive. As each stat you receive a number on a scale of 1 to 100, and rolling under that number equals a success, while rolling over is a failure. Now this target number can be adjusted by the Game Master based on the level of difficulty on the task that's being simulated. Now, if you're a fan of playing magic users, expect an unforgiving world. Not only do you have the typical grim dark tropes of magic is dangerous and magic is hard, pretty likely you're going to be hunted by witch hunters, who are basically like these pissed off pilgrims who are heavily inspired by the Spanish Inquisition. But hey, if you do avoid the witch hunters, there's, well, still a pretty good chance your magic user will just end up as a fancy new flesh suit for some demon. At the end of the day, Warhammer Fantasy World is a game of brutal combat, lingering injuries, and dark decisions. So why do I love this game? Warhammer has a special place in my heart. And now, while it is on the long list of lore that is basically not Europe, they are able to put a fun, grim, dark spin on it, and still leave a fair amount of dry, gallows humor in the setting. Also, Warhammer is a setting that promotes quick combat and creative problem solving. Your party never wants to enter a fair fight, which means combat should be decisive, brutal, and quick. It won't slow down the gameplay. And if you're a GM that loves presenting your characters with morally gray decisions, then this is a world that will give you plenty of opportunity to do so. I think the Warhammer fantasy role-playing game has some of the best pre-published adventures on the market. Specifically, Rough Night at the Three Feathers, and the Enemy Within campaign. If you're looking for a fun game night, be sure to check out A Rough Night at the Three Feathers. This scenario can easily slot into any game setting, as it all takes place in, well, an inn. And ideally, this scenario should be deployed once your party arrives from a tough day of adventuring, expecting nothing more than a rest and relaxation. Over the course of this adventure, the game will turn from another peaceful night at an inn into a Scooby-Doo style murder mystery. And by the adventure's end, your players will never feel safe walking into an inn again. Which is perfect, because if the Warhammer world is trying to convey one feeling, that feeling is you're never safe. Now, for a longer, multiple session spanning campaign, I'd recommend checking out The Enemy Within. This is a great inquisitorial style game. Both of these scenarios have been remastered by Cubicle 7.
Gentlemen, we can rebuild him. We have the technology.
If you're still on the fence about Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, I would also like to add that mechanically, this game is very easy to explain to new players, and its probability of outcomes aren't hidden behind any fancy math. Now, the last game I want to talk about is pretty new and just came out. Whoa. This game was published in 2018. What I meant to say, this last game I wanted to talk about is brand new to me, and I just discovered it during my COVID-19 lockdown. This does mean I haven't had a chance to play it in person yet, but this game and its world immediately drew me in. This is a game that takes place in an urban fantasy steampunk setting, where you are part of the Drow resistance, trying to overthrow the oppressors or the High Elves. Personally, I see this game as a fantasy Ocean's 11, not your traditional sandbox. If you decide to run this game system, it's important to explain in session 0 that this game is a spy flick, and players shouldn't get too mad if their Rambo character doesn't fit in a Tinker Tailor story arc. Very early in the rulebook, this game sets expectation. First, magic is hard, magic is rare, there's no morality system, and there are no monsters. So strap in. We're going to be exploring a grim world that makes you question your actions and feel guilty about leveraging your advantages. And I think this is cool, because frankly, these kinds of decisions don't come up much when you're slaying zombies and skeletons in some dark dungeon. Spire, the city must fall, uses a dice pool system, which means the more skilled you are at something, the more dice you roll. In this system, the dice of choice is a D10. So again, no real fancy math here either. Where Spire, the city must falls, differs from other dice pools is really that only one dice matters. You just take your best result. Well, okay. The system's a little more complex than that, but this is the system in a nutshell.
No, this is me in a nutshell. Help! I'm in a nutshell! How did I get into this nutshell?
So why do I love this game? Like I said before, I really haven't had a chance to play this game yet, so maybe this section is better called Why I'm Super Duper Excited to Play This Game. First off, the artwork in the game looks, wow. Talk about unique. For fantasy roleplay game settings, it immediately draws me in and makes me want to play. Look at that city. Wait, are those neon signs in the city? I want to explore a fantasy city that has neon signs. Look at that thing. Is that a giant flying bug thing? I want to ride a giant flying bug thing. And wow. Who is that guy? What is he up to? I know what he's saying. That this game does so well is its setting. I don't know about you, but whenever I try to introduce new players to a setting that they're not familiar with, sometimes it overwhelms them with too many questions. But Spire doesn't try to introduce you to an entire world. They instead introduce you to a city. Spire's world building goes deep, not wide. So much so that leaving the city of Spire is treated how most games treat character death. Okay, you left. You're gone. Your story ends. Make a new character. Because this story is about the city. And your character is no longer a protagonist. Spire also does a good job of introducing itself to new players by drawing on classic fantasy tropes that any RPG player probably is familiar with. But it doesn't hesitate to turn them on their head. You know, all that drow lore in our Dungeons & Dragons monster manual? Well, it turns out that's just high elf propaganda. So these are 3 RPG games that are like D&D, but aren't. But wait, don't leave. We're not done here. I have an honorary mention. Before we do that, I need to pay the YouTube bills. And if you made it this far in the video, then I hope you're enjoying my content. And if you'd like to support the channel, you can do that by checking out the links in the description below. But more importantly than that, I'd really appreciate your help growing the channel. Try sharing it with some of your gaming friends. So back to that honorable mention. Envelope, please. Well, that honorary mention is, crap. It's not in here. Sorry, I recently moved and I can't find the game I wanted to talk about. And I swear, this isn't some clever YouTube ruse to get you to hit that notify bell for a future video. I am, honestly, just a hopelessly unorganized individual. How about we talk about Savage Worlds? Frankly, this is a really cool game, but I wouldn't consider it a fantasy game. This is more of a universal rule set that you can use for just about any setting you'd like to run. Now, I have run a fantasy setting with this rule set, and it was still a blast. Savage Worlds is a great game system for you if you want to run a short campaign. Say focused around a movie you really liked, or a favorite childhood novel. But nothing that you're really sure you want to commit a year-long spanning campaign with weekly game night. Savage World also makes great one-off rule sets for, conventions or just getting a bunch of people together to play a quick game. It's very streamlined. People will quickly learn it, but it also will max characters out pretty quickly. Savage World uses a dice progression system where you roll a d4 for any attempt that you're unskilled, and then you roll a d6, d8, d10, or d12 as you become better at that skill. And in this game, there's really only 2 types of monsters: regular dudes and wild cards. Wild cards are basically the player characters. And by being wild card, that means they can roll wild dice with their skill dice. So this gives them a competitive edge over the general mooks and goons on the table. You will also make named villain wild cards. For example, Dracula would be a wild card, but his brides or vampire spawns, they would not. Also, combat in Savage Worlds is super swingy. You really only have 3 stances: good to go, shaken, and out. If a model is good to go, well then it's good to go and can act and move regularly. A model who is shaken is stunned and must pass an endurance check before it can act. And a model that is out is, well, out of play and removed from the table. Now, only wild cards have wounds, or can take multiple hits before they're out. This means that only the players are really tracking damage for themselves, and the GM is, at most, probably only tracking hit points for 1 to 3 models during an encounter. There's hardly any bookkeeping. This is honestly how I still run minions in my D&D games. Lastly, Savage World uses a deck of cards, which is a pretty creative initiative system, because it's super easy to track who goes when. And if you do pick up Savage Worlds, the skins that they publish are amazing. Especially check out Space 1889, which is basically Buck Rogers meets Lawrence of Arabia. I also recommend checking out their Deadlands setting. This is like Tombstone with a sprinkling of Blade. And lastly, Weird War, which is basically the opening to Hellboy. Well, that's all I got for now. I'm Dave, you're watching Table Ready Gaming, and until next time, good luck storming the castle.